All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to yet another episode of Masters of Code, a series wherein we talk to technologists about technology and everything on the periphery of it. I'm really excited to host Vibhore Sharma today. Uh, I've had the pleasure of knowing Vibhore for a really long time. Vibhore is right now investing in deep tech startups. And before that, he has spent almost 22, 23 years at Naukri building from the scratch to what you see as a chief technology officer. Vibhor, really glad to have you on the show.
Feeling very mutual, man. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Great. Vibhor, today we're going to talk about development is beyond writing code, or as you say, dev is beyond writing code. We're going to touch upon a lot of aspects in terms of what all does it entail. But before that, I just want to set the context here. Why don't you tell a bit about how do you feel about this topic and how close is this to your heart?
Yeah, I think I'm very passionate about this subject, honestly, because I've seen over the last couple of decades when I sort of got into writing code, in the early days of internet, in the late 90s, early 2000s. I've seen a lot of evolution of the technology stack, from a slowish, pace of evolution to unbelievably fast change of evolution of technology. I've seen students coming out of colleges and having a perspective which was far different, over a period of time, than what it is now. And I've seen people mature, age in the ways of software, and the craft, right? I build products, I've groomed people, I've learned a lot from people I've worked with. And I've seen that, look, writing code is just, a part of the job. It is not the job alone, right? And I think I've learned it from experience that bit.
All right, makes sense. So what does it entail according to you, right? When you say that development is beyond writing code, what are you talking about? Are you talking about some specific skills? Are you talking about them having team management or interpersonal skills, soft skills, or what is it, right? And then where do we set the realistic expectations also here? Because it cannot be everything, right? So what are some of those crucial, I'll say, attributes which you're referring to here?
Yeah. No, those are all the right things that you've said. I mean, but if I were to distill it down to one core thing, it is making choices / making decisions, right? Because as a developer, as a technologist, the most fundamental thing you're doing is choosing, everything. Choosing which feature to build, choosing which technology to use, choosing how to write code, down to the level of whether or not I should use a case statement or an if statement, a for loop or a while loop, fundamentally speaking. You're making choices. Right from, should I make the decision myself? Should I involve a couple of more people? Should I write this in JavaScript? Should I, write this in any other language that I like? Which database storage and so on and so forth. So one dimension is choosing technology. Which technology should I use? Second is understanding the relevance of the technology in my context, right? And therefore, the bigger question then comes is, what is my context? How well am I aware of my context? Essentially speaking, the view has to be far more bigger than just saying, I'm writing this piece of code at this point in time, right? And you can bake in concepts of systems thinking here, but the real point is that I'm a developer working in this small code base, trying to make changes to it because I'm part of a squad. The squad is part of a team. The team is part of a department, and so on, right? And then it sort of expands and zooms out to a level where you say, well, you're working in an organization, in an industry, solving a specific problem, so to speak, right? And that is really the zoomed out context that you have to have at the back of your mind. And it's actually very paradoxical, because when I'm writing code to solve a very, very specific thing at that point in time. Like I said, whether or not, what variable do I choose? Is it going to be an integer, a character, a float, or so on and so forth? What do I name the integer? Should I write a function? Should I write a class, and so on and so forth? But at the back of this, level of abstraction is the real thing, which is, I'm working for a company which is solving logistics through software, for instance, right? Which means what are the trade-offs that I'm ready to or willing to make in this context for this feature that I'm building, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but
Thanks for that explanation, about. But I'll like to go back a little bit and ask that: do you think this is applicable for all the developers? Because don't you think it will kind of cause some sort of chaos, or you want certain specific developers? You think it makes sense because they have been in demand for really right now. The demand for developers is insane, right? And not everyone, if you want to be just looking at context, looking at this, that, everything, won't it get chaotic? So is it applicable for everyone, or do you think that only certain set of developers, people have certain aspirations, should target this?
The answer to this is sort of layered, because it'll boil down to how do we hire developers? What do we expect out of developers, right? Now, and I've been in the recruitment space also for a long while. Naukri was a platform which helped companies hire, and I've done hiring myself. I've had people hiring also. And I think the fundamental question is, why are you looking at hiring people, right? And if you ask any hiring manager or people who are in the interview loop, as now it's called, they say that, oh, we need more headcount, right? Now that is to me half the answer, right? Because you need headcount to do what, right? So if you're talking about developers working as part of an assembly line where you're more focused on output, right? Yeah, please go ahead and indiscriminately hire developers at the price tag or salary and comp that you want, because you want to beef up the numbers, because you think more number will help you produce more output. And we have Conway's law, which talks about this all the time, and it's being cited in several conversations. But if you're talking about outcomes, right, that is far more different than in focusing on developer productivity, output, number of lines of code, what kind of features, number of features you're releasing, how many tickets you're addressing, and so on and so forth, right? And I'm talking about this more in the context of product development, companies and startups building platforms and so on, right? Because their software is not based on a service. The software is the product, right? If you're building products, you've got to be more focused on the outcomes that the team is churning out, right? What impact is the work that a bunch of people are doing is having, on the end user, on the industry per se in question, right? And therefore, I think fundamentally every job description that you write as a hiring manager or as a team lead or whoever is deciding that we should hire more people has to have in the underbelly this understanding and answers to these questions. Why do we need to hire this position for this position? And therefore, who will fit this position?
All right. Let's move to the next step then. Once those people you've made the right hires at the context here and all, how does this vary in terms of different roles? And here I mean particularly two kinds. One is the IC role, individual contributor, when somebody wants to grow in that path, versus somebody who wants to get into team lead and managing the teams from that side of things. So, to what extent does it vary?
Yeah, I'm a sucker for contesting definitions, right? So therefore, I would say, we should contest the definition of IC, individual contributor, right? Because fundamentally, if you look at the likes of, Linus Torvalds or more recently, Butchalik, who built Ethereum, right? Linus was Linux. These are individuals, or Rasmus Ledorf, who created PHP, or Doug Cutting, who created Lucene, right? There were people sitting somewhere in some part of the world and saying, what, I can create a new programming language, I can create a new blockchain, I can create an unstructured text for search, right? And they did that, right? But in the context of an organization, right, you're never an individual contributor, right? the system primes you and is biased towards individual contributors, because that works, right? Because instead of having 4 people do the job, you'd rather have 1 person do that job who has the context, the understanding, the experience, and the capability as defined by doing work faster than 3 people who are new, right? So all systems or organization structures rather, or even incentives, which is called appraisals and increments, are attuned to, aligned to, and biased towards favoring individuals who are doing more work than other people, right? Now, and therefore, the debatable definition of 10x developer, right? But if I were to answer what a 10x developer is, I would say it's not a person who can do the job of 10 people in one go. I would say is the person who can enable 10 more people to do the job as well as he or she is doing, right? Because that is the power of compounding, right? Because then you're not priming people to fit a bell curve for your appraisal cycle, right? But you're having a sizable number of people who can contribute qualitatively towards the progression and evolution of the platform in question. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean,
it makes some sense. I mean, we slightly distracted, but I think that was relevant to extent. Okay, now let's jump on the different attributes or aspects which you mentioned, or which we'll be discussing, right? What all things are required beyond writing code. So the first part is business context, having a business context. To what extent and where does it come handy? And the reason I'm asking is because, look, how much, and all these things, because you can go as deep as you want, and then you can literally leave what you are doing and just focus on that. But there is an optimum amount which is required, and especially you can say from your own experience that to what extent, because if you were in the business of hiring and in managing recruitment space, then to what extent the business context was important, and till what, because an exposure to a developer versus an exposure to a product person versus to a salesperson will be different. So from a developer perspective, how much of an exposure of business context is required?
Yeah, I don't think that there is any harm to overexposure of business context or domain understanding, right? The more the better, right? And I think fundamentally what happens is, and I've seen this, that a lot of value gets created on the fringes of teams and departments which bring different skills to the table, right? When you have these conversations, right? So if I'm a developer and if I'm not questioning what we're doing and why we're doing it, it will impact the how of what I'm doing, right? Because again, talking about context, writing a piece of software which is taking decisions of a certain kind in recruitment is different from a software which is determining the traction control for a vehicle, for example. So if I don't know the context, whether I'm building the traction control system for a front wheel drive car or rear wheel drive car, whether this car is going to be driven on racetracks, whether this car is going to be driven on bad roads, or snow and so on and so forth, I would just say, what, I'll use basic physical constraints and measures and metrics and parameters to determine how much brake I apply and how much traction I push to one or two or all of the wheels of the vehicle, so to speak, from a software parlance, right? Similarly, if you're talking about measuring SpO2, measuring some life-saving parameters, in a medical context, it's different, right? So I think, and these are dramatic examples, but ultimately, the context does lend a lot of color to you questioning what you're doing, why you're doing, and therefore determine how you're going to do that in terms of the choices you make. The latency, the time lapses, the floating point errors.
Okay, so while we'll continue discussing this, tell me one thing, Vibhore, do you genuinely feel that this thing is missing right now in the developers a lot? If yes, then anywhere specifically you have seen in terms of like early stage startups or in corporates or in certain domains that developers are not really focusing on all these contexts and just are writing code?
I think it's again going to boil back, because it's not mutually exclusive. It's going to boil back to how are we incentivizing developers? What is the behavior we're driving as people who are leading teams, people who are leading tech organizations, or overall organizations and businesses in general, right? If you want to optimize for throughput of work done, right, then all I want to do is write code and ship features, and my job is done. That is the expectation from me. That did you finish this in time? Yes, I did. I may have made awful choices and trade-offs, which will show up on the surface, down the line. I may not be there at all, and I don't care. I may be writing crappy code that is hard for everyone else to read, right? I may be indiscriminately throwing requests at a server when I know it is down, because I've not built an understanding of what happens if that server or that API or that service is not working. So I'm not doing any throttling. I'm not doing any clawback of requests per seconds that I send, or retries that I do to that service, and so on and so forth, right? And all that will have a systemic effect, because it's, everything is a cascade in software, right? Because software, like any other system, is a sum of its parts, right? And there's a lot of moving parts working in isolation, right? And if I don't think of my piece of code as a subsystem, which is part of a bigger system, I just keep doing, stuff because I've been expected that to do, that's fine, because nobody's questioning me. You know what? 3 months back, you wrote a piece of code which caused this problem. Let's go back and figure out how to do this and solve for this.
All right, reasonable enough. So going back to the points which we're discussing, the second point I want to talk about is user understanding. Understanding a user. Now here, more than, of course, one part is I want to understand that how should one go about it, because there are 2-3 ways. One is, of course, there are dedicated teams who are focusing on that, from the product side of the things, from the design side of the things, or probably pre-sales, people who are understanding the users, versus as a developer. So you can directly go and do it by talking to users or through some of the other methodologies, or you can sync up with these teams that, hey, what were your findings? What do you think about this and that? Now, as probably the CEO of a company, I would not want all my developers to be directly figuring out the understanding of users. I would prefer that, because I have dedicated teams, there should be great coherence, and maybe some of them, there are exceptions. So, what do you think should be the approach here from the developers side?
Look, I think it's plausible. I know there are thousands of developers in every company. If you talk about the bigger companies, and there are, a handful or hundreds, depending on the size of the company, right? But I can tell you from my experience, when we were building Naukri in the early on days, and we'd launched database search, which was a very, very rudimentary product, I used to go and meet salespeople and get secondhand information from them, or product people would tell me this is wrong and that is wrong. But when I actually did sales calls along with the sales guys, it had a different magnitude of impact, because I was talking to the customer who was really experiencing the problem, and who was telling me, like, I want to use this product, but I can't. And these are the basic flaws, right? And those conversations led to a lot of ideas also, right? Because I could sit in front of the user and see how they were using the product in question, right? And I think some of these things help. I know enough companies who are now trying this out. Tony Zappos of Zappos started this, where you have to sit down and do a support call every now and then, regardless of what team you were in, right? If you're staying in a company for 365 days, I don't think spending a few hours handling support, interacting with customers is an unreal expectation, or not plausible, or just shadow someone who's sitting there so that you can hear out the customers saying something. Because what happens is subjectivity comes in, right? When I'm talking to a product person, I have history, right? I have departmental context / conflict, right? I have maybe a bias from recent sort of incidents and conversations and so on and so forth. So I will take things with a pinch of salt, or I will take it with a lot of salt, and not take it objectively for all you know. Right. So it really helps, when you hear it from the proverbial horse's mouth, that look, the customers are really facing this problem. One is looking at data, and second is experiencing it, right? You're sitting in the air conditioner and the temperature, gate says 40 degrees outside. Yeah, it's hot. Right? When you step out, you feel the heat. sort of idealistic, but I think it really helps because I've seen that help to me, to people who've gone on sales calls, who've spoken to customers, and have really come out with ideas that could solve problems in a very, very simplified fashion, as opposed to complicated solutions.
All right. This makes sense. Um, okay, but while doing all these, how not to get distracted, how to stay focused, because developers are not cheap resources, right? So how to make sure that you're focused in terms of your productivity that's not getting impacted while you're
Yeah.
gaining the business context and all the things which are required, understanding users, and you're asking right set of questions, or generally you're asking questions, right and wrong doesn't matter here. So how to stay focused?
See, that's a constant challenge any which way, right? And if you talk to current developers, or any developer, they say, no, I don't want to be in meetings. My job is to write code, and I think meetings is a waste of time. Believe it or not, back in the day when I was writing actively code, I had a bumper sticker which says I'd rather be coding. Because
But part of it is true. I think you'll agree to it.
Yes, absolutely, it is true. But I'm saying that unless I'm coding for the right reasons, right? I mean, do you want your code to be scalar or vector? That is a fundamental question, right? You have to have a sense of direction which is positive, which is going to cause an impact. If not, 3 days later, then maybe 3 months later, right? So there has to be a general sense of direction for progress, right? As opposed to having a goal that we have to go live by 15th. Come hell or high water, we will not compromise on features or anything. We will just go live. Do whatever you can, right? That's unnecessary pressure, right? In some situations where the software is suffering, the platforms, taking a hit, and there are outages and so on and so forth, that's different, right? Because you're fixing something, right? But when you're building something which has to go to the user, and there is enough conviction that it's going to change the game and have outcome, then you can't talk about output. You mustn't, right? Developers are expensive because we believe that skills are hard. In my view, skills can be taught, can be learned. It's the experience and the context which is very hard to learn and earn, right? And which is why you see a pyramid kind of an approach where you have a seasoned developer being treated differently as opposed to a fresher who's just coming. But a fresher who understands the context very fast because he's been from the same industry, same domain, or even a competition, ramps up much, much quicker and faster than anybody else who has any context. So I don't think it's a distraction. It is actually a potent value add in your repertoire because you can understand what the product person is saying. You can second guess. You can look at the code and say, look, this doesn't work because I know users don't do it like this, right? And you have a better understanding of why you're writing that piece of code, right? Now, of course, you can choose to sort of, not have access to a lot of information if you want. I mean, there is always possibilities of, understanding more and more and more and more, right? But ultimately, the decision is yours, how much understanding you want to be able to write the code. For example, I'd rather talk to people with whom my code base is interacting by virtue of APIs and web calls, to understand how their systems are working, right? And that's again a bigger sort of need in my view, right? One is the domain understanding. Second is the context in my business. And why are we launching this feature now, right? Why is it important? And therefore, what kind of trade-offs can I do to do it faster if it's needed, or better, because that matters more, right? Second is what subsystems is my system interacting with? What are the touch points, right? And how can I interface with them better, to understand their systems, have those conversations, right? It's very, very important, right? And if you dwell on that a bit more, if you like, I can talk about the fundamental North Star for this is the open source movement. Right? If you look at any open source platform, it may have started from 1 or 2 people building it, but when it becomes really popular, there's a lot of people who start contributing to the code base, right? And they're sitting remotely. They're not even co-working in the same space, physical region, geography, etc., etc. But they come with the same understanding, the same purpose, the same mission-like understanding of I have to do this, I have to create this better, right? And there are enough systems and processes within the open source community that enable teams to figure out whether this code should be inside the code base or it should be dropped out when you send a pull request and so on and so forth, or a merge request rather. And that is why it is possible to have that context, yet not be distracted, yet create so much value that a handful of people who build, say, MySQL, right? It is a movement across the world over a period of time. Same goes for any other NoSQL that you take or any programming language that you pick. Because they understand what are the needs of the developer, because they have themselves faced those problems. I cannot use an RDBMS because it has these limitations. Therefore, I will sit down and make a NoSQL database. And I do that because I've been the user myself. I understand what is wrong with this. And I will create something that everybody will say, we didn't think of this, but this makes sense. Awesome.
Got it. So you have covered this whole why, what, how. Is there a framework to go about it? And is there something wrong happening right now? What's the trend? And what's the right framework according to you?
No, see, the frameworks. If you look at outside, what has happened in the cloud scheme of things and in the no-code scheme of things, right? The cloud infrastructure and the platforms have dumbed a lot of the hardware down for people, right? I come from a time where the full stack included the hardware. You need to know what the server is, the CPU is and the memory is, and whether you should a multiprocessor or a parallel processor and so on and so forth, right? But right now, all you need to know is figure out what kind of compute you want, and the cloud systems will give you that. The no-code paradigm is saying you want storage, you want processing, you want database, right? And you have a higher level of abstraction, if you will, of if you look at bubble.io, right? It's bubble, right? I don't remember. But an Airtable is for databases and so on and so forth, right? So they've completely dumbed it down. So I don't think there is it's evolution, right? The narrative has to change is all, right? In every conversation, in every company, in every startup, in every large company, the conversation is to be about, and I keep going back to it, outcome. What are the teams doing? They are product teams. They're not doing projects, right? I hear a developer saying, I'm working on this project. I zone out. I say, it doesn't make sense because you're working on a product. What is the outcome that you're gunning for? First thing has to do is that narrative has to change, that you have to talk about outcomes. You have to incentivize developers, product people, UX people, all alike for those outcomes. Right. I think the bell curve is a shoddy way of doing that. Because then you're saying that only 2 or 3 people out of 25 are awesome. And that is where fundamentally the biggest disconnect happens for the rest of the 18 or 20 people. I am not considered rock star here. I need to go somewhere. I will be a rock star, or at least I get as much as this rock star is getting here.
But sorry to cut you off, but isn't it a bit of idealism here in a lot of stuff which you're saying, especially this?
I guarantee you that all the talks that you're doing, I guarantee most people that you speak to, there will be a bit of idealism, right? But it's not impossible. It's not impossible, is what I'm saying. That because that's how you start. I mean, the fundamental reason that you want to be a software developer is because you have been inspired by people who have been poster childs and poster boys and poster girls, who have made significant impact in the way things work. I mean, that is the starting point always. But somewhere down the line, it gets diluted because when you're thrown in the waters, you see the game to be completely different than what you imagine it to be, right? And therefore, what you do is, right now, someone who knows React Native is getting paid more. Let me do a project on that and get a job in React Native. Right now, people are saying MongoDB is hot. Not many people have that skill. It has happened with everything. It has happened with Linux. It happened with PHP. It happened with mobile apps. The point in time where building for Android was the biggest skill. And you would pay anything for a developer who knows Android development. But now flatline. Right. So these curves have always been there. The problem is because we think as a company that using the next best platform, or as a team or as a techie, that the next best platform is going to solve everything. It's the panacea. It doesn't matter. A lot of the companies are still using the older platforms. I mean, how much of Amazon internally is running on its own stack now? I don't know, but I'm hoping I'm not hoping, but I'm thinking it's not all of it, right? Because that's how it works. Because if it's working, you don't have to fix it unnecessarily. Right? The core is still the same, right? I mean, we've used Lucene in the earliest days possible. Now Lucene is now Elasticsearch, right? But at the core, most of the things are still the same. It's the periphery that's evolving and evolving and evolving, so to speak. Underlying it's still Java, right? So I think there's a lot of disambiguation needed from the standpoint of what matters in a given context.
Got it. Reasonable, I'll say. Okay, so let's talk about the fear part. I mean, not exactly fear part, but the missing part. What do you think people who are not going beyond development are missing? And also in terms of what's the impact, because not writing good code can end up literally shutting down a company in very simple terms. That's the last thing. But again, from the personal side and from the side of the project or the company they're a part of, what are the misses, or what do they stand a chance to lose?
Yeah. So Sid, again, I'll be very happy that I'm not a very structured person. I would have, as you would have realized in the course of the conversation. I think from the company standpoint, the biggest thing is that you lose out on doing the right things. Because if you don't have enough people questioning things, friction is important for a vehicle to run on the ground. Too much friction, the vehicle won't move. Not enough friction, the vehicle will keep slipping about, right? So when opposing views come around, when you question why are we doing it, when you question why should we do it this way, what is the need, and so on and so forth, the right answers emerge. The problem is, more often than not, this becomes a conversation about two different kind of teams bringing two different skill sets, having allegedly different motivations, and therefore the conversations are not fruitful. But if you look at it objectively and you say, what, people are coming with a perspective which is different than mine, and therefore let's humor this and see where this goes, and therefore figure out whether or not we're doing the right thing, right? I fundamentally believe, and I've always said this to teams when I was actively encoding, that if you have 10 days to cut a tree, use 9 to grind the axe, right? Because if you do that, then you're sure that, look, this is the tree you want to cut, and this is the time you have, right? And therefore you understand the reasons and the motivations, and hopefully the outcomes that you want from that feature set or product, if you will, right? So the company gets to have a workforce which is focused on outcomes which help the company grow and become a leader in the space. Because ultimately that is the objective. The objective is not that hire 20 more people so that we can ship code faster. What kind of code? What kind of features? To what effect? You want to be the leader, right? Right. And therefore, and if you have that kind of thinking and understanding, and you have that kind of empowerment, you have a lot of teams and people taking decisions which matter, which makes sense for these outcomes to happen, right? The second thing is that if you're making the right choices, choosing quality over velocity sometimes, for example, right? You will not hit a terrible bottleneck down the line. You will not have scalability issues down the line, because what you want is at all points in time, your platform should be capable in the changing paradigm. You have more users, more transactions, more competition, come what may. You have a system which is capable because the people have been building to think and thinking to build a system like that, right? From the standpoint of the individual, I mean, the most important thing is that you get tremendous amount of learning, right? You get to understand how things work, and not just that I know Java. Big deal. I mean, there are thousands of people out there who know Java, right? Or React Native. But how can you apply that skill? I mean, and we've seen this, you've got hundreds and thousands of drivers out there, driving Uber and Ola, and in general, people driving cars. Knowing how to drive is different from being a good driver, right? And fundamentally, that is what matters. You can write code, yes, but are you really a developer? Are you really a person who can build systems or engineer things? The people look at them and say, look, wow, I mean, I'm not proud of some of the code that I wrote, so many years back. I would go back and think twice, right? But you evolve. The question is, are you learning and evolving or not? Right? And analogically, if you see in the West, you have a lot of engineers, and now in India also now, who are building startups because they are technologists who now understand a problem solution paradigm in a context, right? And they find a niche and they go and build for that niche that nobody else has thought for, and that gives them the edge for the initial years, all right, until VCs bump in the money and make it a level playing field or so on. But fundamentally, you can understand the what and the why, and then how is just application of your skills.
Got it. Thanks. I think now we'll move to the last part of the things, which is the current context. Remote work is on the rise. I don't see it going back, irrespective of what happens. It's gonna stay. Web3 is emerging. Again, all these things are sort of irreversible processes. They're gonna be learnings, they're gonna be curves, but these are. And with respect to developers, the salaries are going to become more and more competitive because technology is something wherein our dependency is going to increase more and more. So it will be something fundamentally led by the developers. So with these contexts, and then also the cultures are changing accordingly in terms of the work culture. I mean, do you think that it's going to accelerate what you had said in some or the other way, and it's going to make a strong case? The whole point of development is beyond writing code.
Well, it is horses for courses for sure, right? Because it'll depend on the kind of culture that you want to create and the kind of product that you want to build, right? But if you look at some of the early stage startups that are coming out also, for example, they're using no code as a baseline, for building anything, because they're saying like, we want to test the markets and the product first. Coding can come later, right? It's the same that happened to the hardware infrastructure earlier on, like I said, with the cloud guys. It did. In Web 3.0, you see, 15, 17-year-old kids, building tremendous amount of products, right? Decision-making is spread around in a democratic way using DAOs, right? Because there is recognition of the fact that diversity creates far more value than unilateral decision-making. So I think that is already on the run, this theory that people are understanding this, at least in the Web 3.0 paradigm. Therefore, you see the concept of tribes. Discord is full of conversations where people are trying to figure out what is the right thing to do for the platform or product in question, right? So I think that is going to be mainstay for sure. Companies through their social organizational structures, if they recognize this, it's great. But I think, again, in companies, the problem is the incentive structure, right? If my goal is appraisal at the end of 6 months or 12 months, and I know what I need to do for that appraisal, how many tickets I need to close, how many features I need to roll out, and so on and so forth, and that is what a product guy, a UX guy will, praise me for. Why will I change? And therefore, if you see, there's a lot of disenchantment that happened. We saw the Great Resignation, the movement, right? Many people left because they realized this. I'm a rebel without a cause, right? Because what am I doing? I'm writing code day in, day out. To what effect? I'm just part of a big machinery. I'm not contributing anything. There is no purpose. There is no sense of achievement, gratification, and so on and so forth. I'd rather work for less or nothing at all in the Web 3.0 paradigm, right? So I think that cultural shift is imperative because people want to be part of the decision-making process. People want to build great stuff which lasts and outlasts them, right? Because that is the only way to leave a mark. So that is going to happen. And remote, like I gave the example of open source, right? It has almost always been remote. Different people, different geographies contributing to the same code base and building products that the world starts using. Nobody is doing quality checks there, except those 4 or 5 people who are maintaining the branch, right? So inner source is already a movement in some parts of Europe, right? Where people are saying, PayPal does that, that, we will work and build software like open source, but for internal consumption and for our own users only, right? Where you use the same methodologies, principles, and so on and so forth. Agile Manifesto said that, right? People over processes, interactions, right? Tool chains, all the enablers that are relevant, for making me write code, because that is one piece of the puzzle. Everything else solidifies a robust understanding about why am I writing this piece of code, which is far more better, important, and of consequence than me writing a piece of code in isolation because somebody's asked me to do that.
Wow, I think that's a very strong case we have built in terms of why development is beyond writing code. I think that should be it from my side. Both, thanks so much for taking out time today. It was fun having this conversation with you.
Thank you very much for having me, man.
All right, thanks, people. I'm your host, Alok Soni, and I'll catch up with you in the next episode. Thanks.